Well, grace and peace to you, friends. Today we are in week 2 of Absurd Scriptures, and we have quite an absurd one here today. It's only 3 verses. This is 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 through 25. And a surface level reading will show you something entirely different than what is actually happening. This is the passage of the Great Mauling, where 42 youths were killed by 2 bears. And so we're going to talk about this in a bit, but I invite you now to hear this word of the Lord from 2 Kings 2, 23 to 25.
From there, Elisha went up to Bethel. As he was walking along the road, some youths came out of town and jeered at him. "Going up, you bald head," they said. "Going up, you bald head." He turned around, looked at them, and called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord. Then 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the youths. And he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there returned to Samaria.
Okay, so to understand this passage, you have to read the entire chapter to really get the full picture. You cannot possibly grasp what's happening in these 3 verses until you understand the context of it all. But basically, there is Elijah and Elisha, 2 different prophets. Elijah was first, and at the beginning of the chapter, he is being taken up into heaven. It's a really visceral moment. It's climactic. Before that happens, though, Elisha wants to take the mantle from Elijah. He's a lot younger. He wants to be that next great prophet. But everyone knew who Elijah was. They knew this was happening. I kind of see it to how, like, a pastor who's been at a church for 30 years and is really well loved by everyone, he retires, and then that next person, you almost feel bad for them because they come, but the congregation's still in love with the last guy. And he's got some work ahead of him because he's pretty young here, and he's the new sort of Elijah, and he's kind of the conduit of God's power, and he's speaking God's words to the people. So then he goes to Jericho. This is the second part of this chapter. He goes to Jericho, the oldest city in the world, but the water is dead. It's tainted with something. It's diseased or whatever. There's no growth that can come from this water. It's impacting their crops. Women are barren. For whatever reason, this water is just deadly. And so he goes there, and God blesses that water. And he says, take a container, put some salt in it, which is counterintuitive because salt tends to destroy water and destroys agriculture. Tosses it in, the water is healed. And fruit is grown again. And the entire city of Jericho is saved. So that's a blessing from God through Elisha. That's great. The third section here, the one that we just read, 23 to 25, we see the curses of God. And if you didn't catch it, what happened was he's going to Bethel, goes to Bethel. He sees these youths. Some translations say small children. There's a lot of debate about that among scholars. They think these are children or youth who are old enough to kind of know right from wrong. That's the point. And they call him Baldy. I think Pastor Curtis mentioned this in a sermon one time, and he said he took great offense to this passage, but they called him Baldy twice. They said, "Go up, Baldy, go up." And then Elisha asks God to bring down a curse. He sends this curse, comes in the form of 2 female bears. These bears kill these 42 youths, or maybe there was more, but there were 42 that were killed. End of story. And that is the curse of God. You see the blessings and the curses. So right on the surface again, you have sort of a kind of, it seems like that Elisha is maybe young and has a frail ego. There's so much more happening in this passage. Susanna, tell us, what is the significance of the location of this passage, Bethel?
It's a good question. Again, you're talking about the fact that Elijah was recognized and well known as a prophet, and Elisha is coming in and stepping into that role and assuming the authority that Elijah once had, and well known in Bethel. Bethel actually, or Bethel, means house of God. And so this is a place where God is worshiped. But we need to know something else about Bethel or Bethel, and that is there was also in this town a shrine to Baal, or Baal as we call him, that the golden calves, think about that imagery that King Jeroboam had constructed and placed in Bethel and also in Dan, another place in Palestine. So there's this schism in the community. And these young boys, as you said, who were probably old enough to know better or know what they were doing by mocking Elisha, they are the children of adults, parents who probably worshipped at the shrine, the idol shrine, not God. So this is leading to quite a confrontation here.
Okay, so they call it Baldy, which seems pretty mean. You read this in the surface again, you're like, wow, why are these kids so mean? But what does Baldy really mean in this situation, Susanna?
There's again two things going on here. They're saying "go up, Baldy" or "bald head," depending on what translation you read. There also are some translations that say "go away, bald head," but it's better translated "go up, balding" or "bald head." And no, we're not talking about our beloved Bald Head Island. We're not talking about Moorhead City. We're talking we're talking about mockery of Elisha himself. That bald head is not just lack of hair, but it's about having an empty head. So they're calling him empty-headed, dumb. The go up is kind of mocking Elijah, for these youth did not believe that Elijah was taken up to heaven. So they're mocking the story of Elijah ascending to heaven. They are mocking Elisha and the authority that he has gained. But more importantly than anything else, Russ, they're mocking God. They're mocking the power of God to do these things, to do these miracles. And so now they're insulting God. And so that kind of sets up what happens next. It kind of provides that motivation for the curse that he sends out to these young boys. You want to say more about that?
Yeah, well, this is not about Elisha's fragile ego. It wasn't about his feelings being hurt and then just punishing these children. This is about God. This is about God bringing blessings to some places and God bringing curses to some people. And God is in the Old Testament, especially, God is a God of blessings and curses. And this is not the first passage where God, took the life of someone who mocked God, rejected God, stood in the way of God's will. Elisha has no power apart from God. This is not about Elisha. This is about God doing what God had been doing throughout the Old Testament. The agent of power in this story is not Elisha, it is God. God was just saying yes because he's committed to Elisha as a prophet. God wanted to do this. And this is not the first example. There are many examples throughout the Old Testament. And so this is an act of God. This is not an act of Elisha. This is not Elisha with a frail ego. This is God seeing this as a people who are rejecting God, standing in God's way, standing in the way of God's will, and God cursed them. So, as a people who follow Christ in light of the New Testament, Susanna, how do we read this now? Where is the hope in this story?
You asked me to think about that question, and I kind of had to kind of chew on it for a while, and I finally realized that the scripture verse that kept going through my mind was actually from the letter to the Hebrews in the New Testament, and it's the first 3 verses, and actually that's where I want to start as we try to think about this in context of our Christian faith. The writer of the letter of Hebrews said this: long ago, God spoke to our ancestors in many and various ways by the prophets, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by a Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, through whom he also created the worlds. This is taking us back to the Gospel of John in a lot of ways. In the beginning was the Word. He goes on to say, the Son is a reflection of God's glory and the exact imprint of God's very being, and he sustains all things by his powerful word. When he had made purification for sins, that is, when Jesus was crucified, not for his sins, but for ours, when he was resurrected by the power of God, when he ascended to heaven to sit at the throne, that's how this writer concludes. Jesus sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. And to me, in those three verses, we capture the essence of who we are now, who God is, and that power to bless and to curse is now culminated in this act of sacrifice by Jesus. And that is where this is the context we have now, is that act of purification, that act of redemption of us, even in our brokenness, is what moves us forward and calls us to be a follower of Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Susanna. Said, and we hope that this little conversation will turn this passage from being kind of a joke to being so outlandish that it's undiscernible, to holding some meaning for you. And so we thank you for listening, and we invite you again to join us next week for week 3 of Absurd Scriptures. There's too many to count, so we could go on and on, but we're only doing 4. Next week is week 3. We'll see you next time.